YouTube. Today we're going to be looking at a couple large bore revolvers, and I had a request to do this, so I always try and do the request if it's all possible. But before we get started, I'm going to let you know that neither one of these revolvers are loaded, and as I pick them up, I will show you there's nothing in them. So what are we talking about today? We're going to be talking about the big Smith and Wesson X frame chambered in 500 Magnum, and we're going to be talking about the new style, newly released, new re-release, I guess you should say, Colt Anaconda chambered in 44 Magnum. And both of these are in the 4-inch configuration. They're very similar and they're very different in different ways. So I'm going to show you some of the differences in them. Now, about these calibers, the 44 Magnum has been around since 1955. Smith and Wesson came up with the 44 Magnum in 1955, the same year that Colt came out with the famous Colt Python that's chambered in 357 Magnum. And the Colt Python was supposed to be the elite top of the line revolver, and everybody always wondered why they didn't make it in 44 Magnum. Well, Colt never got into the 44 Magnum game until around 1990-ish, somewhere around the late 80s, early 90s. They finally came out with a 44 Magnum, and it was called the Colt Anaconda. So I'm going to pick this Colt Anaconda up and show you that it's not loaded and tell you a little bit about it. Now, the Colt Anaconda was released by Colt in the late 80s, early 90s, but it was released in a time where Colt was going through some hardships, and they didn't, their quality wasn't quite what had been in the past, and they decided to save face, and they released the very first 44 Magnum, and it was called the Colt Anaconda, Anaconda being the largest snake in the world. And when they did so, they cheapened it up a little bit. It had a different type of action as the Python. It had a coil spring action inside here. All these parts were all cast. The hammer and the trigger and the fit and finish in it wasn't nearly what the famous Colt Python was. But it did have this ventilated rib and full underlug, and it resembled a Colt Python by looks. But if you really handled one or you really got into it internals, you could immediately see that it wasn't even close to the quality of a Colt Python. Now, it was a very serviceable weapon. It worked real well. They were still accurate. They had a decent trigger on them, but it wasn't even close to the smoothness as a Colt Python. So they feel a little bit short in the quality of the make of the revolver. Now I'm going to show you some close-ups of this, and a couple of years ago they came out with the Colt Anaconda again. The Colt stopped making revolvers altogether around 1999. You can still get a couple of them minus the single action army and the custom shop for a couple of years after that, but basically they ceased all production on revolvers in 1999, and they started focusing more on their military contracts with their ARs, and that went away for many years until around 2017, 2018. They started releasing all these older snake guns again, starting with the Colt Cobra and so on and so on. And a couple years ago they released this one. This is the Colt Anaconda in 44 Magnum. Now, what did they do different to it? Well, they did everything different. Everything everybody always dreamed of in the early or late 80s and early 90s of having a Colt Python and 44 Magnum, well, they have it now. This has got the same action that the newer Colt Pythons has a leaf spring action and that really smooth action that everybody knows about with the Colt Pythons. And the lockup is absolutely tight. The older ones had a little bit of problems, and I have a video comparing an older Anaconda to the newer Anacondas to show you the difference. But this one has to be chambered in 44 Magnum. It has the 4-inch configuration. Now, what I've done to this one is I've changed the sight on it. I put a Wilson Combat rear sight on it. The sights that they put on these things was my only complaint with these new Colt revolvers, and they fell a little bit short. They were a little bit loose fitting here on top, and the Wilson Combat Sight just gives you a better picture. It's a lot tighter fit and just a far better quality product. But overall, this is a fantastic gun. They came from the factory with rubber grips on them, and I've changed them over to these laminate wood grips because I think they look really cool. I don't know how well they'll show up here on camera, but really cool. It's got like nice texturing. It's got these finger grooves in them that feel really comfortable in your hands. Now with a Colt, the action always goes clockwise on it, and it's very smooth with these new Colt revolvers, and it does have that same bank vault tight lockup on them. Now, one of the other things they did with the Colt Anaconda is they beefed up this frame quite a bit when it comes to the older Anacondas. The cylinder on it is absolutely huge, and the frame is a lot beefier, and this thing probably will handle larger calibers in the future if Colt ever decides to do that. And I have a feeling that that's why they made this gun so massive. It's got a lot of stainless, it's made out of stainless steel. It's got a lot of steel in it. It's a very heavy gun. It's got like a little recessed crown on the barrel. The sight can be changed very easily with just an Allen key. Just an overall awesome gun. This is probably my second favorite revolver that I own. I'll show you some of the roll marks on the side of it with the Colt markings, and it's got the little barcode on the side and the serial number on the outside, which I don't care too much for that, but if that's the only thing that they did wrong, then so be it, folks. This is an awesome gun. Now, all the trigger and the hammer and everything on that are forged on this gun. Unlike the older Anacondas, they had cast triggers and cast hammers. You can see the cast lines in them, and it was just terrible workmanship to be put out. Not anywhere close to the older Colt Pythons, but this is an awesome gun, very beefy. The cylinder is probably at least a 1/4 inch larger in diameter and length than the older Anacondas, and you can see my video that compares the two on them. You can see this is a very beefy gun, and I just have a sneaky suspicion that Colt's going to make these in larger calibers one day. I have no insight on that. It's just a guess of mine, folks. There's no other reason to make this beefy. But Colt Anaconda 44 Magnum, 4.25 inch barrel, and very smooth, very good double action. The double action on this thing is very smooth all the way through, and the single action is exceptional. But we're going to compare this to something a little bit larger here and show you what some of the differences are. Now, this one came out, this is a Smith and Wesson 500 Magnum, and these came out around 2003. And up until this time, the 44 Magnum was always said to be the most powerful handgun in the world, and that was true up in, until the late 90s, early 2000s, when some of these larger calibers started coming out, like the Desert Eagle and the 454 Gasol and all that. Well, this one trumps them all, folks. This is a big boy here. I'll show you some of the close-ups of it. This is a 500 Magnum, and it has a changeable muzzle brake here on them, which you actually need. This thing is so massive, and the actual percussion that comes out of this thing when you fire it is unbelievable. Now, if you look at the Smith & Wesson, this is one of the newer ones that everybody hates. It has a little lock on it, but that's the only way they made these, because by the time these came out in 2003, they'd already changed over to making them with the lock on them and having the internal mounted fire pin and the cast parts and all that stuff. But don't get me wrong, folks, it's a great revolver, and I have no complaints about it whatsoever. It has a very smooth trigger to it, and between all the newer ones that I've had and handled and stuff, this Smith & Wesson 500, this X-frame one, seems to have the best out-of-the-box trigger of any of them that I've ever seen. Now, I'm sure there's going to be a couple people that are going to disagree with me, but I don't know what they did to this gun, but it's a little bit better than the other newer ones that I've handled, like the 686 and newer 29s and stuff like that. Now, if you look at the back of the trigger, you can see that it's just a casted trigger on it, and that doesn't hurt anything. Now, if you look at this cylinder, this is a 5-round 500 Magnum, and if you look at it in my hand, this thing is absolutely massive, folks. This is the largest frame that they make, the X frame, and up until when they came out with this X frame, the N frame was the largest they made, and that was the 629 and Model 29, 44 Magnums, and a couple other calibers. You could get like a Model 27 or Model 28 and 357 Magnum that were also N frames, but it had a big gap here because of the smaller cartridge and such a massive gun. They actually made that frame, you know, to handle larger calibers, and when they came out with the 44 Magnum, that's the frame that they use. But if you hold an N frame next to this new Anaconda, it's not even close. This thing's absolutely massive next to an N frame Smith and Wesson. So that's why I think they're going to be putting larger calibers in these things. And at a later date, I don't know that to be a fact, but I just think they're going to. But nothing's as big as this big old X frame. I mean, this thing is absolutely huge. Now, the energy differences and velocity differences, I mean, it's not really that close, folks. If you look at a 44 Magnum, it's a very powerful gun, and people usually carry them in like bear country and stuff like that, and it does work very well. Now, the energy on this thing, you know, you're going to be looking at around 1,500 feet per second with real hot rounds in them, and you're going to be looking at somewhere around, you know, 1,000 to 1,500 feet of energy upon impact. Now, I'm not an absolute ballistics expert. I'm saying this off the top of my head, but this is with pretty hot ammo in it. Now, with the 500 Magnum, you're in a new ball game here. About the minimum you're going to look at is about 2,000 feet per second with a lot larger, you know, 300 grain projectile, and you're going to be looking at 2,000 plus pounds of energy upon impact. So there's not much this thing won't stop, but the backdraw to it is the recoil on him. If you're going to use this for protection against like a bear or something like that, you need to hit your shot the first time, because you're not going to shoot this one very fast, folks. The amount of recoil that this thing has is absolutely almost uncontrollable. Almost. You actually need these big old padded rubber grips on this thing, because this being the most powerful handgun in the world with this short configuration on them, you really need to hold on to it. This is not a beginner's gun at all, but it has a lot of massive recoil, and you're not going to really get off shots really, really fast. Now, you can train with anything, learn how to use it, and improve it, but you're not really going to control this one very well as you would maybe this 44 Magnum with this heavy frame. Now, I'm not saying this thing's a slouch either, because these things have a lot of recoil with this short barrel configuration, this 4 1/4 inch barrel, but it's not even close to the 500 Magnum. But I had a request to show these guns to you side by side, and I figured I would show you what a large frame Colt Anaconda 44 Magnum looks like next to a Smith and Wesson 500 Magnum with the same barrel links on them. We'll open them back up and we'll show you some of the size differences for people that have handled 44 Magnums and 500 Magnums. Look at the cylinder difference, folks, and keep in mind this 44 Magnum Colt is a very beefy cylinder, and it's not even close to the same size as that 500 Magnum, because that's such a massive cartridge. With a cylinder this big, they can still only figure out how to put 5 rounds in them, because if you added another round, I don't even see how you would fit that in a handgun. It's just such a big round. But mainly, the reason I own the 500 Magnum is mainly a novelty. It's just something to say I have the most powerful handgun in the world. Where I live, there's nothing that I would ever need this for or need to use it on that the 44 Magnum wouldn't take care of also. But anyway, folks, let me know what you think about this newer model X-frame 500 Magnum versus the newer model Colt Anaconda chambered in 44 Magnum. They're very similar size. The X-frame is going to be a little bit bigger, and the cylinder difference is a huge difference on these. But anyway, folks, thank you very much for watching my video today, and you folks have a great day.